The first time Alina Volkov held a rifle, she was only 7 years old. The weapon was nearly as tall as she was, a heavy bolt-action hunting rifle that her grandfather Dmitri pressed into her small hands with a knowing smile. They stood in the Ural Mountains, surrounded by ancient pines that stretched toward a steel-gray sky, their boots crunching through fresh snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the weak winter sunlight. "Feel the weight," Dmitri whispered, his weathered face creased with patience. "Respect it. This is not a toy. This is survival." Alina's arms trembled under the rifle's weight, but she refused to lower it. Even then, her green eyes held a fierce determination that made the old hunter nod with approval. He taught her everything: how to track deer by reading broken twigs and disturbed snow, how to control her breathing until her heartbeat slowed to near silence, how to become invisible by moving with the forest rather than against it. But most importantly, he taught her patience. "A true hunter doesn't chase," he would say, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "A true hunter waits, becomes part of the landscape, becomes nothing. And then, when the moment is perfect, only then does she strike." By the time Alina turned 15, she could outshoot every man in their village. She could track a wolf through a snowstorm, field dress a elk in under 10 minutes, and hit a pine cone at 300 meters. The other villagers called her Dimitri's shadow because she moved through the forest like smoke, there and gone before you could blink. Her mother worried she was becoming too wild, too comfortable with solitude and silence. Her father just shrugged and said some people were born for ordinary lives, and others were born for something else entirely. Alina never imagined what that something else would be. June 1941 shattered everything. She was 20 years old, working at the village timber mill, her hands rough with calluses and her heart still innocent to the realities of war. Then the German invasion came like a biblical plague: tanks, artillery, screaming Stukas that fell from the sky like mechanical demons. Their small village near Sverdlovsk wasn't strategically important. It wasn't even on most maps, but it was in the way, and that was enough. Alina was in the forest hunting rabbits when she heard the explosions. She ran 3 miles through dense undergrowth, her heart hammering against her ribs, arriving just in time to watch her world burn. The timber mill was gone, reduced to splintered wood and flames that licked 50 feet into the air. Her family's home, the sturdy cabin her grandfather had built with his own hands, was nothing but smoldering rubble. She found her mother's body first, still clutching her younger brother Ivan, who was only 12. They tried to hide in the root cellar. It hadn't mattered. Her father was in the street, along with 23 other villagers, shot execution style and left in the dirt like discarded trash. Grandfather Dimitri's body lay beside his beloved hunting rifle, which had been smashed beyond repair. Alina didn't cry. Something colder, harder, settled into her chest like ice crystallizing in her veins. She walked through the smoking ruins in absolute silence, her face expressionless, cataloging every detail. The German tank tracks in the mud, the spent cartridge casings glinting in the ash, the smell of burned flesh that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. She buried her family herself, digging in the frozen earth until her hands bled. It took 3 days. She spoke to no one, ate nothing, simply worked with mechanical precision until all 27 bodies were in the ground. On the 4th day, she walked 60 miles south to the nearest Red Army recruitment station. The sergeant looked at her with skepticism, a young woman thin and exhausted with wild eyes and dirt under her fingernails. "We need nurses," he said dismissively, "field kitchens, support roles." Alina placed her grandfather's hunting knife on his desk, the blade worn smooth from decades of use. "I can hit a deer's eye at 600 meters, she said quietly. "In fog, in wind, in the dark. I've tracked wolves through blizzards. I can move through forests so quietly that rabbits don't run, and I have very good reasons to kill Nazis." Something in her voice made the sergeant look up. Something in her eyes made him believe her. They sent her to sniper school near Podolsk. The instructors expected her to wash out, Most women did, not from lack of skill but from the psychological burden of what sniping demanded. But Alina excelled. While other trainees hesitated at their first kill, she felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Her scores shattered records. Her patience was inhuman. She could remain motionless in a hide for 16 hours without cramping, barely breathing, waiting for the perfect shot. By December 1942, she was deployed to Stalingrad, the meat grinder where the war's tide would turn. The city was hell on earth, every building a fortress, every street a killing field, the air thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. Alina moved through the ruins like a ghost, making her nest in bombed-out buildings, piles of rubble, burned-out tanks. Her first confirmed kill was a German officer at 723 meters, through a partially collapsed wall, with a crosswind that would have made the shot impossible for most snipers. She didn't celebrate. She simply noted it in her log, moved to a new position and found her next target. The kills mounted: 23, 47, 89, 134. Each one documented, verified, recorded in official logs. She earned the nickname Snow Death among German troops who learned to fear the sectors where she operated. Fellow Soviet snipers treated her with awed respect. Commanders requested her specifically for impossible missions. At 23 years old, Alina Volkov had 187 confirmed eliminations, a growing legend, and a heart that felt nothing but cold purpose. She had become exactly what her grandfather always knew she would be, a perfect hunter. She just never imagined she'd be hunting men. But in February 1944, a routine defensive mission would test everything she'd learned, everything she'd become. It would transform her from an elite sniper into something else entirely, a phantom, a myth, a one-woman army that would accomplish the impossible and cement her place in the shadows of history forever. February 14, 1944. Alina would remember the date forever, not because of its romantic associations, but because it was the day the world tried to kill her and failed. The briefing had been routine. Captain Volkov, no relation, though the shared surname was a running joke in the unit, stood before 32 soldiers in a cramped farmhouse 12 kilometers from the Polish border. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he traced lines on a crumpled map with nicotine-stained fingers. "This forest corridor," he tapped a green section between two rivers, "is our responsibility. Intelligence reports German movement in the area. Probably a reinforced platoon, maybe 50 men trying to cut our supply lines to the 3rd Shock Army. We hold this position for 72 hours. Air support is promised, but don't count on it. Artillery is stretched thin." Questions? Alina had none. She'd been assigned to the mission specifically because of her skill set. If Germans came through that forest, she'd see them long before they saw her unit. She cleaned her Mosin-Nagant rifle for the 3rd time that morning, running the oiled cloth down the barrel with the meditative focus of a monk at prayer. Beside her, young Private Alexei Komarov nervously checked his ammunition pouches, his hands shaking slightly. "First real deployment?" Alina asked quietly. "Yes, Comrade Volkov." He couldn't have been more than 18, his face still soft with youth despite weeks of inadequate rations. "I'm honored to serve alongside you. They say you've killed nearly 200 fascists." 187, she corrected, her voice flat. "And they weren't fascists when I shot them. They were just targets. Remember that. The moment you think of them as human, hesitation will kill you." The march to the defensive position took 4 hours through deep snow. They reached the corridor at 900 hours, a natural choke point where the forest narrowed between two partially frozen rivers. Captain Volkov positioned them well, riflemen in a semicircle, machine gun nests covering the approaches. Alina elevated in a massive oak tree with perfect sightlines down the likely German advance route. By noon, nothing had happened. The forest was eerily quiet, just wind through pine branches and the occasional cry of a crow. Alina ate cold kasha from her tin, never taking her eyes off the tree line 800 meters distant. Something felt wrong. The air had that electric quality that came before storms or battles. At 13:47 hours, the world exploded. The first artillery shell hit 30 meters from Alina's tree, the concussion wave nearly throwing her from her perch. She grabbed the trunk instinctively, her rifle swinging on its sling. Then came the second shell, the third, the fourth. The bombardment was devastating, precisely targeted, walking across their defensive position with mathematical precision. This wasn't 50 Germans. This was something much, much worse. Alina watched in horror as her unit disappeared in fountains of earth and fire. Private Komarov simply ceased to exist, there one moment and gone the next, vaporized by a direct hit. The machine gun nests erupted in flames. Bodies flew through the air like broken dolls. Captain Volkov's voice screamed orders over the radio before static consumed him forever. The shelling lasted 7 minutes, 7 minutes that felt like 7 hours. Then silence, the terrible, ringing silence that follows violence, broken only by the moans of the dying and the crackle of flames consuming equipment. Alina's training took over. She scanned the tree line through her scope, and her blood turned to ice. They came in formation, disciplined, organized, wearing the field gray of the Wehrmacht. Not 50 men, not even a platoon. An entire company, maybe more, spreading through the forest like a gray tide. She counted quickly, her mind cataloging everything her scope revealed. 140, maybe 150 soldiers, officers with maps, radio operators with backpack sets, heavy machine guns being positioned. This was a full combat unit, and they just annihilated her entire defensive position with preparatory artillery. Someone had badly underestimated German strength, or intelligence had been compromised. Either way, the result was the same. 32 Soviet soldiers had walked into a slaughter. Alina started to climb down, thinking of retreat, of racing back to headquarters with this information. Then the tree beside her exploded. Shrapnel tore through her left shoulder, spinning her around. She fell, crashed through branches, hit the ground hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. Blood spread hot and fast across her uniform. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard German voices, laughing, joking, already celebrating. They were advancing casually, confident the position was neutralized. She saw them moving through the smoke, shooting wounded Soviet soldiers who moaned in the mud. No prisoners, no mercy. Alina dragged herself behind a fallen log, biting down on her glove to keep from screaming. The shoulder wound was bad. She could feel bone fragments grinding together when she moved. Her medical kit was gone, lost in the fall. She had her rifle, her sidearm, and 4 ammunition pouches, 60 rounds total. That was it. The Germans were establishing a camp 400 meters from her position. They clearly planned to hold this corridor, cutting off the supply route exactly as intelligence had predicted. Without this corridor, the Third Shock Army's offensive would stall. Thousands of Soviet soldiers would be stranded without ammunition, food, medical supplies. Alina pressed her hand against the wound, feeling blood pulse between her fingers. The smart play was obvious. Retreat through the forest, get to headquarters, report the enemy's strength. She'd survive. Command would send a proper force to retake the position. Eventually. But by then, the Germans would have fortified. They'd bring up more troops, more artillery. The corridor would be lost for weeks, maybe months. And every Soviet soldier who died because supplies didn't arrive, their blood would be on her hands for choosing survival over duty. She thought of Private Komarov, so young, so eager. Gone. Captain Volkov, who'd shared his tobacco rations with her. Gone. 32 soldiers who'd trusted their commanders, trusted intelligence, trusted they'd face a manageable threat. All gone. Alina looked at her rifle, then at the German encampment. The scope showed their commander, a major, lighting a cigar and examining a map while his men laughed and set up tents. They thought this was over. They thought they'd won. Through the pain and blood loss, Alina felt something cold and certain crystallize in her chest. The same feeling from the day she'd buried her family. Not rage. Rage was hot and stupid. This was colder. This was purpose. 60 rounds, 140 Germans. The mathematics were impossible. Any sane person would retreat. Alina Volkov had stopped being sane the day her village burned. She wrapped her shoulder with strips torn from her undershirt, using her teeth to pull the makeshift bandage tight. The bleeding slowed. Not stopped, but manageable. She checked her rifle, still functional. Loaded a fresh 5-round clip. Found a depression behind a cluster of frost-covered ferns where she was invisible from any angle. Then she settled in, controlled her breathing, and started planning something that had never been done in the history of modern warfare. One woman, one rifle, one impossible mission. The hunt was about to begin. Pain had a way of sharpening focus. Alina's shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, sending waves of fire down her arm, but she used it. Let the pain keep her alert. Let it fuel the cold calculation that now consumed her thoughts. She had maybe 48 hours before infection would make the decision for her, death by sepsis or death by Germans. Either way, time was her enemy as much as the soldiers setting up camp 400 meters away. She forced herself to think like her grandfather had taught her. When hunting wolves, you didn't just shoot the first one you saw. You studied the pack, found the alpha, understood their patterns, their weaknesses, their fears. Wolves were smart, but they were predictable once you understood them. Men were the same. Through her scope, Alina conducted a systematic reconnaissance of the German encampment. She counted 143 soldiers. She'd been close in her initial estimate. They'd established a command tent in the center, easily identified by the constant traffic of officers and radio men. Supply depot on the eastern edge, stacked with ammunition crates and fuel drums. Machine gun positions at the northern and southern approaches. Sentries posted every 30 meters around the perimeter, but they were relaxed, smoking cigarettes, talking among themselves. They weren't expecting resistance. Why would they? They just obliterated an entire Soviet defensive position. Alina's eyes narrowed as she watched the commander, the major with the cigar, emerge from his tent. Even at this distance, she could read his body language, confident, satisfied, already thinking about his next objective. He consulted with 3 other officers, pointing at a map, gesturing toward the eastern river. Through her scope, she could see his insignia clearly. Major Werner Hoffman, she decided to call him, though she'd never know his real name. He would be first. But not yet. Timing was everything. She needed to understand their routine, their guard rotations, their vulnerabilities. So Alina did what she did best. She became nothing. Slowed her breathing until it was barely perceptible. Relaxed every muscle except those needed to hold her position. Let the forest consume her until she was just another shadow among shadows, another shape among the ferns and fallen logs. Hours passed. The sun tracked across the sky, weak winter light filtering through the pine canopy. Alina didn't move, didn't eat, barely blinked. She just watched, cataloged, planned. The Germans settled into their temporary home, some sleeping, some eating, some cleaning weapons. Guard rotation happened at 1600 hours. 6 sentries replaced by 6 fresh ones. Casual, undisciplined. They were veteran troops, but they'd gotten comfortable, lazy with recent victories. That comfort would kill them. At 1743 hours, Major Hoffman returned to his command tent. Through the canvas, Alina could see his silhouette as he sat at a field desk, probably writing reports. 2 guards stood outside the tent entrance, rifles slung casually over shoulders. Inside, the major was alone, illuminated by a kerosene lamp that turned him into a perfect shadow puppet. Alina checked the wind, light 3 kilometers per hour from the northwest. She calculated the distance again, 417 meters, adjusted for the slight downward angle from her position, accounted for the temperature drop as evening approached. Her rifle was zeroed for 400 meters, so she'd aim slightly low. The canvas would slow the bullet fractionally, perhaps 2 centimeters of drop. She had one chance at this. If she missed, they'd go on high alert. If she hit, she'd have perhaps 30 seconds of chaos before they organized a response. Either way, after this shot, the real game would begin. Alina thought of Private Komarov, Captain Volkov, 30 other soldiers whose names she'd never bothered to learn because getting close to people just meant more pain when they died. She thought of her family, of grandfather Dmitri teaching her that a true hunter strikes only when the moment is perfect. This moment was perfect. She settled the crosshairs on the shadow behind the canvas. The major's head slightly tilted as he read or wrote. She could see the glow of his cigar, a small orange dot that marked him like a target beacon. Her finger found the trigger, not resting on it but touching it with the gentleness of a lover's caress. Inhale, exhale. In the space between breaths, in that microsecond when the body is perfectly still, when the heart pauses between beats, that's when death arrives. Alina squeezed. The Mosin Nagant bucked against her wounded shoulder, sending fresh agony through her body. She bit down hard, tasting blood from her split lip, but kept her eye on the scope. Through the magnification, she saw the major's shadow jerk violently backward. The canvas showed a dark stain spreading where his head had been. The silhouette collapsed, and the lamp fell, plunging the tent into darkness. For one perfect second, nothing happened. The camp continued its evening routine, oblivious. Then someone screamed. The guards burst into the tent. More screaming. Officers came running. Within 30 seconds, the entire camp erupted into chaos, soldiers grabbing weapons, scanning the tree line, shouting contradictory orders. They fired blindly into the forest, hundreds of rounds chewing through bark and branches, hitting nothing but air and shadow. Alina was already gone. She'd planned her retreat before taking the shot, a crawl route through a shallow ravine that led 180 degrees away from her firing position. The Germans would assume the shot came from where the bullet entered, never considering she might have relocated. She moved like water, silent and fluid, ignoring the screaming protest of her shoulder. After 60 meters, she stopped, found a new hide beneath the exposed roots of a massive fallen oak, and settled in again. Through her scope, she watched the chaos continue. They'd sent out search parties, 20 men splitting into 4 groups, moving cautiously into the forest. Their flashlights bobbed like fireflies in the gathering darkness. Amateur hour. They just made themselves targets. But Alina didn't shoot. Not yet. Let them search. Let them find nothing. Let the fear build. The psychological component was just beginning. She waited until full darkness fell, until the search parties returned empty-handed, until the camp settled into nervous, alert silence. They'd tripled the sentries. 18 men now stood watch, their eyes straining into the black forest, seeing threats in every shadow. No one slept. Everyone was on edge. At 21:34 hours, Alina found her second target, the radio operator, distinguished by the tall antenna of his backpack radio set. He stood near the supply depot, speaking urgently into his handset, probably reporting to German headquarters that they'd come under sniper fire. His flashlight illuminated him perfectly against the dark background. Distance 523 meters. Wind negligible, difficulty minimal. Alina's rifle spoke again. The radio operator dropped mid-sentence, his equipment sparking as the bullet passed through his chest and into the radio itself. The camp erupted again, more shooting, more chaos, more voices screaming into the darkness. They were firing in the wrong direction, convinced the shot came from the west when Alina was positioned to the north. She was already moving to position 3. By midnight, she'd eliminated 5 targets. The major, the radio operator, 2 lieutenants who'd been trying to organize a proper defense, and the unit's only medic, a calculated cruelty that would mean any wounded Germans would have no one to treat them. 5 shots, 5 kills, 5 different positions. The Germans had fired over 3,000 rounds in response, hitting nothing but trees. Alina finally allowed herself to rest, finding shelter in a partially collapsed hunting blind that predated the war. Her shoulder was worse, hot, swollen, definitely infected. She used precious drinking water to clean it, packed it with moss that had natural antiseptic properties, and wrapped it again. The fever was building. She could feel it in the way her thoughts occasionally drifted, became fuzzy around the edges. She ate a piece of hard bread, chewed some birch bark to fight infection, and rationed her water. 55 rounds remaining. Approximately 138 Germans still combat effective. The mathematics were still impossible, but they were getting better. Through the trees she could hear the Germans. They weren't laughing anymore, weren't celebrating. Some were arguing, voices high with fear. Others were praying. She could hear the rhythm of it, though not the words. They'd gone from confident conquerors to frightened men in 6 hours. Good. Alina checked her weapons one more time, then settled into the shadows to wait for dawn. The real hunt would continue then. She'd become what her grandfather always knew she could be, a perfect predator. But now she was hunting the most dangerous prey in the world. And she was just getting started. Dawn broke gray and cold, the kind of February morning where the air itself seemed frozen. Alina hadn't slept, couldn't risk it. Instead, she drifted in and out of consciousness, jerking awake every few minutes, her grandfather's voice echoing in her fevered mind. A sleeping hunter is a dead hunter. Her reflection in a puddle of melted snow showed a stranger, face pale and drawn, lips cracked and bleeding, eyes burning with something that looked less like determination and more like madness. The infection was spreading faster than she'd hoped. Her entire left side felt like it was on fire, and when she tried to lift her arm above shoulder height, white-hot agony nearly made her black out. But her trigger finger still worked. That was all that mattered. Through the morning mist, she watched the German camp. They'd changed. The confident, casual atmosphere of yesterday had evaporated like dew under a harsh sun. Soldiers moved in tight clusters, no one venturing more than 10 meters from the nearest cover. Sentries stood back to back, weapons pointed outward, jumping at every sound. Several men were digging hasty foxholes, preparing for an attack they couldn't see, couldn't predict, couldn't stop. At 6:47 hours, a new officer emerged from the command tent, a captain based on his insignia, now the ranking commander. He was older, maybe 45, with the bearing of a professional soldier. Alina watched him through her scope as he gathered his officers for a briefing. Even from 600 meters away, she could read the tension in their body language. The captain pointed into the forest, issuing orders. 20 men formed up, a full patrol, heavily armed, moving with tactical precision. They were coming to hunt her. Alina smiled without humor. They'd just made a fatal mistake. She moved to position 4. A location she'd scouted during the night, a rocky outcrop that gave her elevation and multiple escape routes. She'd prepared it carefully, setting up crude noise traps along 3 approach paths, empty tin cans suspended from fishing line at ankle height, positioned where they'd be invisible in the undergrowth. Not sophisticated, but devastatingly effective in the fog. The patrol entered the forest at 7:12 hours, spreading into a search line. They were doing everything right, technically, maintaining intervals, checking corners, moving cautiously. But they were hunting a ghost who knew every meter of this terrain, who'd spent the night studying every dip, every shadow, every killing field. They were soldiers in her forest now, and the forest always belonged to the hunter. Alina let them come. Patience, always patience. They moved deeper into the woods, the mist swallowing them one by one. Through her scope, she tracked the rightmost soldier, a sergeant, recognizable by the extra equipment pouches and the way others kept glancing at him for guidance. He was competent, alert, scanning the trees methodically. He'd dive first. The sergeant passed within 3 meters of one of her noise traps, miraculously missing the wire, but the soldier behind him didn't. The tin cans rattled, a sound like bones shaking in a cup. Every German head snapped toward the noise. Alina fired. The sergeant's head snapped back, and he collapsed into the ferns. Before his body hit the ground, she'd already worked the bolt, chambered a new round, and acquired her second target, a soldier who'd panicked and stepped into the open. 2 shots, 2 bodies, then silence. The Germans did exactly what she predicted. They went to ground, taking cover behind trees and rocks, scanning desperately for her position. But they were looking in the wrong direction. Her muzzle flash had been concealed by the outcrop's shadow, and the sound had echoed off the rocks, making it seem like the shots came from everywhere and nowhere. She didn't move, just watched, waited. After 90 seconds of terrified silence, the patrol's new leader, a young lieutenant, started shouting orders, trying to rally his men. They began moving again, more cautiously now, but moving. They had to. Staying still in enemy territory was death. Moving was death. Every choice was death. They just didn't understand that yet. Alina had already relocated. A 30-second crawl through a drainage ditch put her 200 meters northeast of her previous position. The forest was her chessboard, and she was moving the pieces with invisible hands. The third kill came 5 minutes later. A soldier made the mistake of silhouetting himself against the pale morning sky. Through her scope, Alina saw his face, young, maybe 22, terrified. For a microsecond, she saw Private Komarov. Then the German's face became just another target, and she squeezed the trigger. 4, 5, 6. Each shot from a different position. Each position abandoned before the Germans could orient on it. She was using every technique her grandfather had taught her, firing from shadows, using natural sound barriers, relocating constantly. The Germans were shooting thousands of rounds, turning the forest into a storm of lead and splinters, but they were shooting at ghosts and echoes. By 900 hours, 11 of the 20-man patrol were dead. The survivors had broken into smaller groups, some trying to retreat, others pressing forward. They'd lost all cohesion, all discipline. She could hear them calling to each other, voices high with panic. The noise traps claimed another soldier, not by alerting Alina, but by sending a German into a panic sprint that ended when he tripped over a root and impaled himself on his own bayonet. Alina watched through her scope, made sure he was dead, and moved on. Nature itself was hunting them now. At 10:47 hours, she found 3 Germans huddled in a crater, too terrified to move. Through her scope, she could see them praying, clutching crucifixes, tears streaming down their faces. Part of her, the part that was still Alina Volkov, village girl, human being, felt something twist in her chest. Then she remembered Captain Volkov's body, shot to pieces in the mud. Remembered Private Komarov, vaporized by artillery. Remembered 32 soldiers who'd never go home because someone had to die in this frozen forest, and it wasn't going to be her. She fired 3 times. 3 bodies slumped in the crater. The hunting continued. One German tried to surrender, standing with his hands raised, sobbing in German that Alina didn't need to translate. But there were no prisoners out here. No witnesses. Only survivors and corpses. She shot him through the heart, quick, clean, almost merciful. By noon, only 3 patrol members remained alive. They'd abandoned all pretense of searching and were running flat out for the camp, crashing through undergrowth, screaming for their comrades. Alina let them go. Let them return. Let them tell their stories about the invisible demon that had slaughtered 17 men without ever being seen. Fear was ammunition too, and it never ran out. She found a stream, drank deeply despite the risk of parasites, and assessed her condition. The fever was worse. Her hands were shaking now when she wasn't actively shooting. The shoulder wound had gone from hot to numb, a bad sign. She had maybe 24 hours before her body betrayed her completely. 40 rounds remained, approximately 122 Germans. Alina reloaded her rifle, checked her ammunition pouches, and began moving toward her next position. The sun was high now, burning away the mist, turning the forest into a cathedral of light and shadow. And in that cathedral, she was both priest and executioner, conducting a service that would be remembered in whispered horror for generations. The patrol survivors burst into the German camp at 12:14 hours. Alina watched from 800 meters away as they collapsed, gasping, pointing back at the forest. She saw the new captain's face go white as he counted the returnees. 3 out of 20. The entire camp erupted into chaos again. Men were shouting, arguing, some demanding they abandon the position entirely. The captain was shaking his head, probably under orders to hold at all costs. Good. The longer they stayed, the more of them would die. Alina settled into her new hide, a fallen tree that had created a perfect natural blind, and began selecting her next targets. The psychological torture was working. They were breaking, and broken men made mistakes. She'd make sure every mistake was their last. Darkness fell like a coffin lid closing. Alina's world had narrowed to a tunnel of fever dreams and crystal-clear moments of focus that came and went like lighthouse beams cutting through fog. Her internal clock told her it was 18:43 hours, but time had become elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made her question reality. She'd killed 4 more Germans during the afternoon, a supply runner carrying ammunition, an officer trying to organize defensive positions, 2 sentries who'd made the mistake of standing too close together, allowing her to take them both before anyone could react. Every 20 minutes, another shot, another body, another spike of terror rippling through the camp. But the fever was winning. Alina could feel it consuming her from the inside out. Her shoulder had swollen to twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and hot. When she changed the bandage during a brief moment of lucidity, the smell of infection had been overwhelming, sweet and rotten, the smell of flesh dying while still attached to a living body. She'd tied herself to a tree trunk using her belt and a length of parachute cord she'd scavenged from a dead German. If she passed out, she wouldn't fall and give away her position. If she died, well, at least she'd die upright, rifle in hand, facing her enemies. Grandfather Dmitri would approve. The Germans had stopped all movement after sunset. Smart. They'd pulled everyone inside a tight defensive perimeter, lit by fire barrels that turned the camp into an island of light surrounded by an ocean of darkness. 18 sentries now ringed the position. She counted them through her scope, watching their nervous movements, the way they jumped at every sound. They were afraid of the dark, afraid of what moved within it. They should be. At 20:34 hours, Alina began the night's true work. She'd positioned herself 400 meters due west of the camp, close enough to make accurate shots, far enough to remain invisible. The first sentry died at 20:47 hours, a headshot so clean he simply crumpled without a sound. His partner didn't notice for 17 minutes until he turned to ask a question and found a corpse standing next to him. The screaming brought everyone running. Flashlights cut through the darkness like panicked eyes. They found the body, pulled it inside the perimeter, and doubled the remaining sentries. Now they stood in pairs, each watching the others back. Alina smiled through cracked, bloody lips. Perfect. She'd already moved, an agonizing crawl through frozen mud that left her gasping and seeing stars. Position 6 was a depression behind a rotting log, 300 meters south of her previous hide. The camp was visible through a gap in the vegetation, the sentries silhouetted perfectly against their fire barrels. At 22:19 hours, she killed 2 more. One shot through the first sentry's neck, the bullet continuing through to catch his partner in the shoulder. Not a kill shot on the second man, but he'd bleed out in minutes without medical attention, and their medic was already dead. The Germans responded by pulling all sentries inside the perimeter. They were abandoning external security entirely, huddling together like sheep surrounded by wolves. The psychological warfare was working better than she'd dared hope. But Alina's body was betraying her. Between shots, she was hallucinating, seeing her grandfather standing in the forest, watching her with sad eyes. Seeing Private Komarov, his body whole again, asking why she hadn't saved him. She'd bite her tongue until blood filled her mouth, using pain to anchor herself to reality. At midnight, she implemented the final phase of her psychological operation. She'd prepared for this during the afternoon, gathering supplies from dead Germans, 3 signal flares and a half-dozen tracer rounds. Now she used them. The first flare arced into the sky northeast of the German camp, bursting in brilliant red light that painted the forest in hellish crimson. Before they could react, she fired 3 tracer rounds into dry brush on the eastern edge of their perimeter. The phosphorus ignited dead leaves and twigs, creating a small fire that spread quickly in the winter wind. 30 seconds later, another flare to the south, more tracers to the west, more fires. The Germans were surrounded by flames, small, scattered, but positioned in a perfect circle around their camp. It looked exactly like what it was meant to look like. Multiple Soviet units closing in, preparing for a coordinated assault. Alina heard their voices rising in panic, saw them scrambling to defensive positions, machine guns traversing wildly, officers screaming contradictory orders. They were firing at shadows now, at movement that existed only in their terrified minds. Muzzle flashes lit the camp like a thunderstorm, thousands of rounds disappearing into empty forest. She'd created the illusion of an entire battalion, using nothing but psychology and fire. At 1:47 hours, she killed the captain. He'd been moving between defensive positions, trying to maintain order, visible by the flashlight he carried. The shot was difficult, 623 meters, slight crosswind, moving target, but Alina's muscle memory took over when her conscious mind failed. The captain fell, and with him fell the last vestiges of German discipline. Men were crying now. She could hear them through the chaos, grown soldiers weeping, calling for their mothers, praying in desperate voices. Some were trying to surrender to the darkness, hands raised toward fires and shadows. Others were arguing for immediate retreat. A few had simply frozen, catatonic with fear. Alina counted her remaining ammunition by feel, her vision too blurred to trust. 27 rounds. She'd killed 34 Germans in total. The number felt significant somehow, though her fevered brain couldn't remember why. The fires burned lower as dawn approached. The Germans had stopped shooting, conserving ammunition, waiting for the dawn assault that would never come. They didn't understand they weren't fighting a battalion. They were fighting one woman who refused to die before her work was finished. At 5:12 hours, as gray light began filtering through the trees, Alina finally allowed herself to collapse. She fell sideways, the parachute cord catching her, leaving her suspended against the tree like a broken puppet. Her rifle clattered from nerveless fingers. She forced her eyes open one more time, looking toward the German camp. Through blurred vision, she could see them, maybe 90 soldiers left, huddled in their defensive positions, staring out at the forest with hollow, haunted eyes. They looked like men who'd seen ghosts. They had. Alina's eyes closed. She was done. The fever had won. At least she'd taken plenty of them with her. At least she'd died fighting. At least. Her grandfather's voice, clear as crystal despite being dead 3 years. "You're not dead yet, little wolf, and wolves don't quit until their heart stops beating." Her eyes snapped open. Her heart was still beating. The rifle lay 3 feet away. She could see it through the swimming darkness, could see the German camp beyond it, could see targets. Alina reached out with her right hand. Her left arm was useless now, completely dead, and dragged herself forward, inch by inch. The belt cut into her ribs but held. She reached the rifle, pulled it close, found a stable position wedged against the tree. Through her scope, blurry and unstable, she found a German soldier standing guard, silhouetted against the dawn sky. Her finger found the trigger. 27 rounds left. The sun was rising. The hunt wasn't over. The German retreat began at 6:34 hours, just as the sun cleared the horizon and painted the forest in shades of blood and gold. Alina watched through her scope as the new commander, a grizzled sergeant who'd survived 2 nights of hell, made the decision that would seal his unit's fate. He was ordering evacuation. Through the ringing in her ears and the fog of fever, Alina could see them breaking down camp in frantic haste. No orderly withdrawal, no tactical movement, just panicked men throwing equipment into trucks, abandoning heavy weapons, desperate to escape the forest that had become their graveyard. Some were already running, not even waiting for orders, disappearing into the trees like rabbits fleeing a wildfire. Alina's strategic mind, the part still functioning beneath the delirium, understood immediately. They'd retreat east toward the main German lines. There was only one viable route, a logging road that cut through the forest 3 kilometers from their current position. Narrow, exposed, perfect. She had to get there first. Moving was agony that transcended description. Each movement sent lightning bolts of pain through her ruined shoulder. The infection had spread into her chest. She could feel it when she breathed, a wet, crackling sensation that meant her lungs were beginning to fill with fluid. Her left arm hung useless, the hand black and swollen. She was dying, but not yet, not until the work was finished. Alina untied herself from the tree and fell, caught herself with her right hand, started crawling. The rifle dragged behind her, tied to her belt with parachute cord. Her vision swam, doubled, cleared for seconds at a time. She navigated by instinct and memory, heading east, following the terrain she'd studied from maps during the briefing that seemed like a lifetime ago. 700 meters, that's how far she had to go. She made it in 43 minutes, an eternity of dragging herself over roots and rocks through frozen mud and snow. Twice she blacked out completely, waking minutes later with no memory of losing consciousness. But each time she kept moving. Wolves don't quit. Grandfather's voice, constant now, keeping her tethered to purpose when her body screamed to surrender. The logging road appeared through the trees like a gift from a savage god. Alina dragged herself into position 50 meters from the road, behind a fallen log that gave her cover and a perfect firing lane. She could see 200 meters in each direction, a killing field with no cover, no escape, no mercy. At 7:49 hours they came. The first Germans appeared on the road, moving fast, almost running. No formation, no discipline, just terrified men fleeing towards safety that didn't exist. Alina let them come closer, waited until a dozen were visible on the road. Then her rifle spoke. The lead soldier dropped. The column stumbled to a halt, men diving for cover that wasn't there. The exposed road offered nothing, just frozen mud and scattered stones. They were trapped in the open, and Alina was positioned perfectly to enfilade the entire length of road. She worked the bolt, fired, worked the bolt, fired, each shot precise despite her shaking hands, despite vision that kept fading to black at the edges. Muscle memory carried her when conscious thought failed. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd been born for, this mechanical dance of death that required no thought, only execution. 6 men died in 30 seconds. The rest scattered into the forest, abandoning the road. But they'd have to come back. The forest on either side was too dense for vehicles, too difficult for rapid movement. The road was their only option. And Alina owned the road. The Germans tried again 15 minutes later, this time with suppressing fire. 3 men with machine guns laying down cover while others attempted to rush past. Alina ignored the bullets chewing up the log in front of her, waited for the runners and dropped 2 before they made it 20 meters. The machine gunners couldn't see her, were firing blindly at her muzzle flash. She adjusted her position slightly, found one machine gunner's head visible above his own cover, and removed it. The other 2 machine gunners fled. This pattern repeated for the next hour. The Germans would attempt to pass, Alina would kill enough to break their courage, and they'd retreat. Her ammunition was dwindling, 12 rounds left, now 10, now 7. But so were the Germans. She could see bodies littering the road now, at least 25, maybe more. The living were breaking, fracturing into individuals rather than a unit. At 9:23 hours, everything changed. Alina fired at a German officer trying to rally his men. The shot went wide, her first miss in 2 days, a sign of how far gone she was. And in that moment, someone on the German side finally figured it out. She saw them through her scope, a 3-man counter-sniper team, identifiable by their specialized rifles and the methodical way they were scanning the forest. They'd been watching, waiting for her to fire, and now they had her. The first bullet hit the log 6 inches from her head, showering her face with splinters. The second punched through her right thigh, the impact spinning her sideways. The third caught her in the ribs below her right breast, and she felt bones shatter. Alina's world exploded into white agony. She couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't think. Just pain, infinite and consuming, drowning everything else. But her hands remembered. While her mind screamed, her body moved on autopilot. She rolled right, ignoring the fresh damage this caused, and brought her rifle up. Through the scope, now cracked, the glass spiderweb but functional, she found the first counter-sniper. Fired. His head snapped back. Worked the bolt with her one functioning arm, chambered a round that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Found the second counter-sniper, who was frantically trying to acquire her new position. Fired. Center mass, he folded like paper. The third counter-sniper broke and ran. Alina tracked him for 3 seconds, her crosshairs dancing because her hands were shaking so badly. She fired, missed, worked the bolt, fired again. The running man fell face first into the mud and didn't move. 3 rounds left. Alina tried to move, to relocate like she'd done 100 times before. Her legs wouldn't respond. She looked down and saw blood, so much blood, spreading across the frozen ground in a dark pool. The thigh wound had hit an artery. She was bleeding out. Her right hand found the wound, pressed against it. Blood pulsed between her fingers with each heartbeat, hot and vital, her life draining into the earth. This was it. This was how it ended. Not dramatically, not in a final heroic charge, but here, behind a log, bleeding out while the enemy. No. The word came from somewhere deep, somewhere primal. Grandfather's voice or her own, she couldn't tell anymore, but it was absolute. No. Alina dragged herself forward, used her right elbow and her one working leg, leaving a trail of blood behind her like a slug's path. 20 meters. Had to move 20 meters to the secondary position she'd scouted. If she stayed here, they'd find her, kill her, or worse, capture her. 20 meters became 10. 10 became 5. Her vision was going black, consciousness slipping like water through her fingers. She could hear Germans on the road again, voices arguing, some demanding they keep trying, others refusing to move forward past the bodies of their comrades. Alina reached the new position, a dense thicket of thorn bushes that would hide her body even if she passed out. She wormed her way inside, thorns tearing her uniform, her skin, adding negligible pain to the symphony of agony already consuming her. Through the branches she could see the road, could see Germans gathering, perhaps 40 left now. They were done, finished. Some were crying openly. Others had simply sat down, rifles abandoned, faces blank with shock. The sergeant was screaming at them, but no one was listening. They'd broken completely. One soldier stood and started walking west, back toward the German lines alone. Then another. Then 5 more. The mass exodus had begun, not a retreat but a rout. Men abandoning equipment, weapons, everything, just desperate to escape this cursed forest and the demon that haunted it. Alina watched them go through fatting vision. Let them run. She'd done what she came to do. The corridor was held. The supply line was secure. The mission was. Darkness took her and she fell into it gratefully, her rifle still clutched in her hand, 3 rounds still in the magazine, ready for enemies that were already gone. Alina woke to voices. German voices, close enough to touch. Her eyes snapped open, every survival instinct firing despite her body's protests. She was still in the thorn bush, lying in a pool of her own blood that had partially frozen beneath her. 3 German soldiers stood 15 meters away, searching the area, poking through brush with their rifle barrels. They were looking for her body. Alina didn't move, didn't breathe. Through the tangle of branches, she watched them search, getting closer. One soldier was talking, young, his voice shaking. Maybe she wasn't even real. Maybe we're all going crazy. One woman couldn't do this. It's impossible. Her body has to be here somewhere, another responded. The blood trail leads right to. A shout from the road interrupted them. All 3 Germans turned and ran back. Alina heard engines, trucks starting up, the sound of the final remnants of the company preparing to flee. Through gaps in the thorns, she watched approximately 40 soldiers pile into 3 vehicles and speed east, leaving their dead where they fell. But not all of them left. As the truck sounds faded, Alina heard different movement. Closer, more organized. Through her scope, she didn't remember retrieving it, but it was in her hands. She saw them. Roughly 40 Germans who hadn't run. The hardcore survivors, the ones too stubborn or too professional to abandon their position completely. They were moving with purpose toward a stone farmhouse 300 meters northeast. Alina understood immediately. They were fortifying, making a last stand while they waited for reinforcement or a proper extraction. The farmhouse was defensible, thick stone walls, small windows, clear fields of fire in all directions. Smart tactics. Professional soldiers refusing to become a panicked mob. She should let them go, should use this opportunity to escape, to drag herself towards Soviet lines to survive. She'd done enough, more than enough. The mission was accomplished. But if they held that farmhouse, they'd call for reinforcement. An entire company lost would bring German attention. They'd send scouts, search parties, maybe a full battalion to secure the area. And they'd find the corridor weakly defended, discover how few Soviets actually held it. Everything she'd done would be for nothing. Alina looked at her rifle, 3 rounds, looked at her body. She tied her belt around her thigh as a tourniquet, but blood still seeped through. Her ribs grated with each breath, making wet clicking sounds. Her left arm was completely black now, useless meat hanging from her shoulder. Medically speaking, she was already dead. Her body just hadn't accepted it yet. The farmhouse was 300 meters away. Beyond it, perhaps 50 meters further, stood an old barn, weathered wood, partially collapsed roof, but it would offer height and a firing position. Alina began to crawl. It took an hour of dragging herself through frozen mud, leaving a blood trail a blind man could follow. Twice she passed out from pain, waking minutes later with no memory of stopping. But each time she continued. Past the farmhouse, keeping low, moving during moments when the Germans were busy barricading windows. Past the open ground. Into the barn. The interior was a cathedral of decay. Old hay rotted in corners. Ancient farming equipment rusted into abstract sculptures. But there was a loft, accessible by a ladder with half its rungs missing. Alina stared at it. 10 feet of vertical climbing with one working arm and legs that barely functioned. Impossible. She started climbing. Used her teeth to grip the rungs, her right arm to pull, her good leg to push. Each movement was an individual battle against gravity and agony. 3 times she nearly fell, but grandfather's voice kept her going. The wolf climbs because the alternative is death, and death can wait one more day. She reached the loft at 10:34 hours and immediately collapsed. For 5 minutes, she simply lay there, breathing, existing, feeling her heart beat its stubborn rhythm. Then she crawled to the loft's edge and set up her position. The farmhouse was perfectly visible, 347 meters away. She could see Germans moving behind windows, barricading doors with furniture, establishing firing positions. They'd done well. The farmhouse was a fortress. Under normal circumstances, it would take a platoon to dig them out. But Alina didn't need to dig them out. She just needed to keep them contained. At 11:27 hours, she fired her first shot. A German appeared in a window, scanning the area with binoculars. Alina's bullet took him in the chest, and he disappeared back inside. The farmhouse erupted in gunfire, rifles and machine guns chewing up the barn's exterior, punching holes through ancient wood, sending dust and splinters raining down. Alina didn't move, didn't return fire, just waited for the storm to pass. It took them 18 minutes to stop shooting. When silence returned, Alina fired again. A different window, a different German trying to assess the situation. Another hit, another body. This became the pattern. Every time they tried to observe, to maneuver, to do anything but cower inside, her rifle spoke. She was rationing her ammunition now, had fired her 3 rifle rounds and switched to her sidearm, a TT-33 pistol with 15 rounds. Pistol accuracy at 350 meters was essentially zero, but she wasn't trying to kill them anymore. Just suppress them, keep them pinned. Hours crawled past. The sun tracked across the sky. Alina drifted in and out of consciousness, but some autonomous part of her brain kept watch, kept firing, kept them trapped. At 15:47 hours, she heard engines. Different ones. Soviet engines. She recognized the sound of GAZ-67 reconnaissance vehicles. Her reinforcement had finally arrived, drawn by the reports of heavy fighting in this sector. Through the barn loft's opening, she watched them approach cautiously. A Soviet patrol, maybe 20 men, moving tactically through the forest. They spotted the carnage first, bodies littering the logging road, abandoned German equipment, the signs of a major battle. Then they saw the farmhouse, and the occasional muzzle flash from Alina's position. The patrol's lieutenant used hand signals, deploying his men in a semicircle around the farmhouse. Alina could see his confusion. Why was one sniper pinning down what looked like a significant force? The Germans saw the Soviet troops and made their decision. Their barricade was strong against one sniper, but against an actual infantry unit, they had no chance. At 16:34 hours, they charged. It was desperate, brave, and utterly futile. 40 men burst from the farmhouse, firing as they ran, trying to break through the Soviet line before they could react. Alina's pistol came up. She was beyond aiming now, beyond conscious thought. Her body moved on pure muscle memory, the accumulated experience of 2 years of combat condensed into mechanical precision. She fired as fast as she could pull the trigger, each shot guided by instinct rather than sight. 6 Germans fell before the Soviet troops even processed what was happening. 6 more bodies to add to the count. 6 more souls sent into darkness by a woman who'd become something more than human, or perhaps less. Then Alina's pistol clicked empty. The world tilted sideways. She realized she was falling, the rifle slipping from nerveless fingers. Her body pitched forward over the edge of the loft, and she fell into darkness, both literal and metaphorical. Her last thought was surprise. She'd expected to feel something at the end, relief, satisfaction, regret. But there was nothing, just the distant sound of gunfire, fading like a radio signal disappearing into static. The barn floor rushed up to meet her. And Alina Volkov, who had been a daughter, a granddaughter, a hunter, a soldier, and finally a phantom that haunted a frozen forest, surrendered to the darkness she'd been fighting for 3 days and 2 nights. Somewhere far away, she heard grandfather Dmitri's voice one last time. "Rest now, little wolf. The hunt is over. You've earned your sleep." The Soviet soldiers burst into the barn seconds later, weapons ready, expecting to find an entire sniper team. What they found instead was one woman, broken and bleeding, barely breathing, lying in a spreading pool of blood. But she was still alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was still alive. Alina woke to whiteness. Not the darkness she'd expected, not the nothing she'd been prepared for, but blinding, sterile whiteness. Hospital lights, clean sheets, the smell of disinfectant and carbolic soap instead of blood and gunpowder. For a confused moment, she thought she died and this was some Soviet version of heaven. Then the pain hit, and she knew she was still very much alive. A nurse appeared above her, young and startled. "Doctor, she's awake. The sniper is awake." The next hours were a blur of medical examinations, doctors speaking in rapid voices about infection and blood loss and impossible survival. Alina learned she'd been unconscious for 3 days, learned they'd amputated her left arm at the shoulder. The infection had spread too far to save it. Learned she died twice on the operating table and been brought back both times by a stubborn surgeon who refused to let Russia's greatest warrior slip away. On the 4th day, she was coherent enough to receive visitors. The first was a Red Army colonel she'd never met, a man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much war. He sat beside her bed, holding a leather folder that looked official and heavy. "Comrade Volkov," he began, his voice careful, respectful. "We've completed the battlefield assessment. We needed to be certain, needed to verify every detail before making our report." Alina said nothing, just waited. "The German company you engaged consisted of 143 soldiers. We found 89 bodies directly attributable to your rifle and sidearm, verified through ballistics and trajectory analysis. 12 survivors were captured, all suffering from severe psychological trauma. The remaining 42 are unaccounted for, presumed to have scattered into the countryside or died from exposure while fleeing." He paused, looking at her with something like awe. "You held that corridor for 52 hours, alone, wounded, against impossible odds. The supply line remained secure. The Third Shock Army's offensive proceeded on schedule. Thousands of Soviet lives were saved because of your actions." Alina stared at the ceiling. 89 confirmed. The number felt abstract, meaningless. She couldn't remember most of their faces, couldn't recall the individual moments of death. It had all blurred together into one continuous nightmare of blood and gunpowder and fever dreams. "The motherland wishes to honor you," the colonel continued, opening his folder. "Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest decoration we can bestow. There will be a ceremony once you've recovered. Newspapers want interviews. You'll be famous, Comrade Volkov, a symbol of Soviet courage and—" "No." The word came out flat, final. The colonel blinked in surprise. "No," he repeated. "No interviews, no publicity. I did my duty, that's all." Alina's voice was hollow, emptied of everything except exhaustion. "Give me the medal if you must, then let me disappear." The colonel studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened. He'd been in enough wars to recognize the look in her eyes, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much, done too much, and couldn't come back from it. "As you wish," he said quietly. The ceremony happened in a small room with only necessary witnesses. They pinned the gold star to her hospital gown, shook her remaining hand, took official photographs she never looked at. Then, as promised, they let her disappear. Alina spent 6 months recovering. Physical therapy taught her to function with one arm. Psychological therapy tried to help her sleep without nightmares. It failed. Every night she was back in that forest, watching faces appear in her scope. Every night she heard their screams, their prayers, their final gasps as her bullets found them. The therapist said she was suffering from what they called combat fatigue. Alina knew the truth was simpler. She'd become a monster in that forest. A necessary monster, perhaps. A monster that saved Soviet lives, but a monster nonetheless. And monsters didn't get to sleep peacefully. When they finally discharged her in August 1944, Alina didn't return to her unit, didn't accept the propaganda tour they offered, didn't become the symbol they wanted. Instead, she submitted her resignation, honorable discharge on medical grounds, and vanished. She went home, or what was left of it. The Ural Mountains welcomed her back without judgment. She built a small cabin near where her village had stood, far from roads, far from people. She hunted for food, fished in the streams, lived in silence broken only by wind through pine trees and the occasional cry of wolves in the distance. Years became decades. The war ended. Stalin died. The Soviet Union changed, evolved, eventually collapsed. Through it all, Elena remained in her mountain solitude, aging quietly, speaking to almost no one about the 3 days that had made her legend. But legends have a way of surviving, even when their subjects try to bury them. In the 1970s, German military historians began publishing memoirs from Eastern Front veterans. Buried in these accounts were references to Die Walgist, the forest ghost, a demon that had haunted a forest corridor near the Polish border in February 1944. Veterans spoke in whispers about watching their entire company destroyed by an invisible enemy they never saw, never caught, never defeated. She wasn't human, one survivor wrote. No human could do what she did. We were professional soldiers, veterans of 3 years of war, and she made us feel like children lost in a nightmare. I still dream about that forest. I still hear the shots. I'm 70 years old and I still wake up screaming. Soviet military records remained classified, but rumors spread anyway. The story of the woman who'd killed 89 Germans in 3 days became folklore, told and retold until truth and myth became inseparable. Elena Volkov died on March 15, 1997, at age 77. The local doctor found her in her cabin, sitting in her chair, her grandfather's old hunting knife on the table beside her. She died peacefully in her sleep, finally granted the rest she'd been denied for 53 years. 3 months later, with the Soviet Union gone and archives opening, her story was declassified. Military historians confirmed what had seemed impossible. One woman, one rifle, 52 hours, 89 confirmed kills. The most devastating solo combat action in modern military history. Museums wanted to honor her. Historians wanted to study her tactics. The Russian Federation wanted to posthumously award her additional medals. But Elena's will was simple. She'd left instructions to be buried in the Ural Mountains, in an unmarked grave beside the ruins of her childhood home. No monument, no memorial, just silence and forest and the wind through the pines. Her final request was honored. Today, military academies around the world study the Battle of the Forest Corridor as an impossible case study in individual combat effectiveness, psychological warfare, and absolute refusal to surrender. Her tactics are analyzed, her shots reconstructed, her decisions debated by soldiers who will never face what she faced. But they miss the essential truth. Elena Volkov wasn't a tactical genius or a superhuman warrior. She was just a woman who refused to die before her work was finished. A woman who became a wolf because wolves were what the moment demanded. A woman who paid for victory with her humanity and spent the rest of her life trying to find it again in the silence of mountains. Somewhere in the Ural forests, wind whispers through ancient pines. And if you listen carefully, very carefully, you might hear the echo of a rifle shot that changed history. Or maybe just the memory of a hunter who never missed. The end.
Sì. Sì, era bellissima la canzone di prima. Revisi sto patatato. Eccoci qua, ci siamo. Dubbi esistenziali su Malenia. Mi immagino, Yves. Oramai ti triggera? Oramai triggera. C'era... Piratino l'ha fatta la settimana scorsa. Piratino l'ha fatta la settimana scorsa e quando qualcuno entrava e faceva, metteva Malenia, diciamo che era un bel trigger. Era un bel trigger per far venire gli incubi a Piratino.